About Adam Smith, they used to say, or maybe some people still think it, or maybe nobody's really sure, was there an Umschwungstheorie, a turning around, a reversal between the Adam Smith of the theory of moral sentiments, which was a theory of human morality based on, well, he called it sympathy. It was more of an inter-awareness. More about it later, but later Adam Smith became the advocate for unleashing self-interest and capitalism. Boogeyman. He definitely became a kind of boogeyman. David Graeber. Is there a Two David Graeber? Is there a Three David Graeber problem? This video, it's obviously dedicated to David Graeber in the sense that it's about David Graeber. And it's different from the Adam Smith problem. Well, I mean, obviously Adam Smith, there were theories like Adam Smith went to Paris and learned something else. And then he changed his mind about morality being important. And then capitalism, the amoral system, becomes actually what he's advocating for kings and governments to preserve the wealth of their nations. Well, Graeber worked with multiple people. Sahlins was the teacher who was then confused about whether he was actually the student or the teacher. Hudson is the implicit, or, if you look through Debt, this is about Michael Hudson, the economist's revisions about early history. Graeber's take on that. Graeber bringing his anthropological acumen, pedigree. Well, and then we might have a third David Graeber, which is the dawn of everything David Graeber, where he's working, obviously, with the archaeologist Wengrow, reconsidering even these divisions between state and tribal, forager, hunter-gatherer, agricultural, being complicated, these categories about deep history. The kind of drama, conflict, juxtaposition between the Hudson-Graeber and the Sahlins-Graeber. The Sahlins-Graeber best represented, I believe, in the collection on kings, which included new materials in 2017, but which is based in earlier work. Hudson-Graeber, let's call it Debt, implicitly Hudson, from 2010, Occupy times. Hudson's whole point is that ancient state sovereignty allowed for debt forgiveness of the laboring classes, which stabilized society and improved quality of life. And we've lost that. And Hudson articulates it even better in his recent 2023, The Collapse of Antiquity, where he puts forward that Greece and Rome lost maybe the best thing about ancient divine kings in early states, which is they could forgive the debt, thereby cut the aristocracy, cut the oligarchies. It's a Machiavellian theme in a sense. The king needs to be there. The prince needs to cut the aristocracy in order to serve the people. Graeber seems to go very much in line with that in Debt, but we can maybe wonder if he was. And on kings, sovereignty is the problem. Sovereignty is the cruelty. The king is the cruel and terrible one. It's when you get mass human sacrifice that you know there's a king in the archaeological record. So does the dawn of everything, the most recent Graeber work, which was finished by Wengrow after Graeber tragically passed away in 2020. So that's really the question, isn't it? Is there a third David Graeber? And did the other two David Graebers coexist, where you had the advocacy for sovereignty, relief from debt oppression, and the cutting down, maintenance of overgrowth of the aristocracy oligarchy, which Hudson points to as the main problem in the West today? Was that coexisting with the anti-sovereignty? Obviously, the anarchist is the Sahlins, it seems like. Because Sahlins was the one who came up with the idea of hunter-gatherers were the original affluent civilization. So we need to go back to tribal anarchy. Maybe. And that seems to have influenced, in fact, Jared Diamond and his kind of take and critique of progressivist theories of human history. And then everybody says that Diamond influenced Harari, who then, having achieved massive popularity, Wengrow and Graeber's Dawn of Everything targets Harari as oversimplistic narrative. It's a neo-progressivist, techno-post-humanism, something. Well, they're not into it, but what do they have as an alternative? It's kind of complex. If they have one, or if they had one, and you don't know, because this is the problem. It's if Deleuze, pardon the comparison, but if Deleuze died in the middle of the writing of Anti-Oedipus, and then you can also compare Graeber and Wengrow's Dawn of Everything to the old Empire and Multitude. So you got Deleuze and Guattari's Capitalism and Schizophrenia, plus What is Philosophy? Empire and Multitude, this other co-authored volume. It's funny, in the sense of the historical themes or the targets of the subject matter, Graeber-Wengrow would really come first as the primarily deep history. Then you'd have Deleuze and Guattari, who did the most to link their understanding of the state and nomads or savages, sovereigns, and civilized men. And then finally, Hardt and Negri really didn't do that much with early history. They are, in Empire and Multitude, you see a genealogy of their own contemporary political thought going back to Machiavelli through Marx, and Deleuze and Guattari, including Deleuze and Guattari. Well, then in terms of when these projects appeared, Deleuze and Guattari were first, then Hardt and Negri. Then the Graeber-Wengrow collaboration, which is only one book too. But there is something more going on here in terms of what you might call the afterlife of theory, or the politics of the afterlife of theory. Zizek had something to say about Dawn of Everything in his 2022 book, Freedom. I went to go look at that because in Dawn of Everything, they write that this is a book about freedom. Dawn of Everything is a book about freedom. Well, Zizek's book on freedom, Freedom, a Disease Without Cure, came out in that same year, just 2022, in a chapter on the limits of spontaneous order. Spontaneous order, Hayek's idea that you need a free market. It's also called Cadillacsy. You need a free market to explore what is beyond the limits of human knowledge and planning. What can't be planned, innovation, mainly innovation, but also tacit knowledge, that which is working within not unconscious, but within relationships of production that are not standardized by the state and that aren't even necessarily described explicitly by or that would take too long, or that would create inefficiencies if they needed to be explained. Forms of expertise that would create inefficiencies and that don't need to be fully explained to state administrations and so on. The limits of spontaneous order, that was where he discussed Graeber and Wengrow and praised their work towards a new anarchism, apparently. And why is that interesting? Well, because for the last 20 years, Zizek has been a kind of gadfly to the Hardt and Negri project. His continual point, which he also said about Deleuze and Guattari, and this is in chapters such as Goodbye, Mr. Desiring Nomad, or Negri and Davos, or Deleuze without Negri. He's saying you are arguing against state sovereignty, and you are really just arguing for capitalism. Because, Hardt and Negri, you're just like Deleuze and Guattari. And really, Machiavelli came through in the Hardt and Negri project because they were arguing for some kind of a popular sovereignty, or then they later said a non-sovereignty of the people, an anti-sovereignty, but it's of the people, not invested in any sovereign, as was argued for in Machiavelli and I guess in Hobbes as well. And I made the connection earlier between the Hudson idea that you need a strong sovereignty, or that earlier states, what was good about them was that they had a strong sovereign who could wipe away debt. That connection to Machiavelli is not in Hudson, but it is in this afterlife of theory, if you will, in the Hardt and Negri, how to integrate that. Sovereignty or no sovereignty. So we're zooming out here from the Two David Graeber Problem, but this is still the Two or Three David Graeber Problem. There was actually a little dust up in 2008 between Graeber and Zizek on Simon Critchley's New York Times blog about philosophy, where Graeber called Zizek a comedian. So it's nice that in 2022 Zizek was praising Dawn of Everything, but it's kind of not really clear what he really has to say. It's really a tangent in freedom. Looking at that, though, made me realize I need to do a video just on Zizek, so keep an eye out for that. And you can see that Occupy, which Graeber was associated with, clearly is actually almost the topic of Hardt and Negri's 2016 assembly, or there's kind of a lineage being drawn between that 1960s, 70s activism that Hardt was connected with through Negri and these, the past 15 years of various highly media reported protests, global. Some people say that a lot of those protests were actually organized with the help of the National Endowment for Democracy, which would mean sovereignty was protesting itself, or sovereignty was protesting capitalism. Sovereignty was protesting against the capitalism which Zizek said that Hardt and Negri were actually only always arguing for. Sovereignty was in a mask protesting against capitalism. The origins of sovereignty, though, this is interesting in Graeber. Sahlins. This is the Graeber who's against sovereignty, whereas the Hudson-Graeber stood up for the necessity of some kind of a sovereignty. But there's no theory of the origins of sovereignty in Graeber-Hudson. Although there is the acknowledgement, especially in the recent Hudson work, we're talking about divine kingship, pre-axial age divine kingship. And in Graeber-Sahlins, sovereignty is very strongly connected to ritual. And even in Dawn of Everything, in spite of the way that the style of this book just sort of anything that seems like an assumption kind of gets ripped out and cast aside. The exceptions to every rule are brought out. Really, I don't see anywhere where sovereignty is disconnected from ritual there either. So Belief-O-Nomics, as ritual declines, it becomes harder and harder to invest in any sovereign, not to invest money in any sovereign, but to believe and delegate the power to the sovereign to decide when to disperse the debt. And you get, in Hudson's analysis, you get these oligarchies or aristocracies, including the church, who step in there and maintain debt relations, or who push to keep the sovereign from upending debt relations, keeping the oligarchy in power over, basically workers and the indebted. So two paths here before we go back to Adam Smith. The first, there's more to the Belief-O-Nomics in Graeber's work than just ritual and ritual's connection to sovereignty, divine kingship in the Sahlins. When Graeber in Debt talks about academia or the prevailing opinions amongst what he perceives as the majority of anthropologists, convention, the conventional take, convention. He was against convention. In Dawn of Everything, we have the standard narrative is the problem. The entangling vines of terminology that we have for norms. It's something I talk about in Belief-O-Nomics. So here it's how Graeber refers to his own milieu, academia and academic norms, is kind of a mix-up. And everybody does it. But here in Belief-O-Nomics, what I recommend is convention is for norms based on imitation. Standards are for norms created by dialogue with reference to the good. In Belief-O-Nomics, it starts with Socrates because ritual was where people believed in what they did. Anyway, there could be a whole discussion about these. Point being, this was an anti-conventional anthropologist. And bullshit jobs and academia. Isn't there a connection here? And it brings us back to Adam Smith, because division of labor does not necessarily mean specialization. And this is kind of the whole problem when we look at that big chart of where we've come in modernity. Academia certainly figures there, isn't it? It's hiding in there. Bullshit jobs and specialization that, in a sense, rationalize the norms of debt creation in academia has become, can we really believe in it anymore? Sahlins actually passed away just shortly after Graeber, and he had a posthumous publication where he really kind of stands up and he defends myths and rituals, ritualized belief of so-called primitives. It's very interesting anthropological belief. And yet, can we really believe in what the university does today? What a brilliantly non-specialized humanist. That said, in Debt, the thing that really bothered me when I first read it, which was when I first saw it, I was in Ritual Coffee Shop. That's on Valencia in San Francisco, because I had moved up there from UCLA. This was the time of the Occupy protests. I hadn't really heard of David Graeber, but I ran into at the Adbusters senior editor, Michael White, who I knew. He was a protester back in the post 9/11 times. Started a anti-war protest then. I had seen him around in Berkeley at like a Lorraine Daston lecture, maybe one other time. And so I stopped him. He was coming out of the library. He told me he was headed over to New York to do a protest down on Wall Street, and they were going to call it Occupy Wall Street. And next thing you know, it was all over the news. And obviously there were plenty of events in Oakland where I lived at that time. Well, so Debt, though, there's that line. It's a footnote, actually, where he says, basically, Deleuze and Guattari, why did you like Nietzsche? You should have liked Maus. So you get this sense that this is Graeber Maus. And there was this emphasis on the gift and gift competition, or potlatch, as an alternative to, war. And yet Graeber's clearly choosing Nietzsche over Smith, although then he puts them together in the same category, saying economic relations, structure, society. But really, I think Genealogy of Morals and what Deleuze and Guattari liked about Nietzsche is that he's saying that, in a sense, cruelty, but ritualized cruelty and punishment, is foundational to the sovereignty which would then make economic relations possible, where you have the small tribe that, in the anthropologist's imagination, there's no need, because there is this, like Graeber talks about, a primitive communism. But as things start to get bigger, ritualized punishment becomes more important, and ritual grows up out of this imagination of kinship, maybe even kinship with nature. And all of that grew out of kinship exceeding its bounds. Of course, the main point of Debt, in addition to this Hudson enduring struggle to have a sovereignty that can wipe away debt, there was the idea that money is not based in barter. There's no natural origins for money where something rare simply naturally comes to be the common equivalent. This was the state theory of money. Debt argued for the state theory of money, where money came after the state's ability to record and enforce debt. So as you get sovereignty, one of its functions is to keep track of and enforce the debts, and then money functions in order to facilitate that. Probably a little bit of both, isn't it? All of these things depend on property. So sovereignty arises to facilitate, protect, and even to limit, depending on all these different permutations, property, which is not unique to humans, but the way that properties has been unfolded into all these different arrangements is clearly, in humans, far beyond anything seen in other species. Reading over, though, some of these earlier collections of David Graeber's, because David Graeber was born in the same year as Obama. Put it in perspective. Obama is not that young anymore, right? And I was in Philadelphia in 2000 for the Republican convention protests, happened to be down there. And I remember going to the puppet theater. They had hours where you could come and visit. Graeber wrote about the puppet theater and visiting there. I don't know, I can almost see him there. I was only there for a couple hours. The chances he was actually there at the same time I can see him there. Another seemingly off the track but actually significant story Graeber talked about was from when he was at UChicago and he was walking by Swift Hall, and there were police outside. They were investigating the crime scene of the murder of the religious scholar, Mircea Eliade's student, already a professor in his own right, Ioan Couliano, who was shot in the head in a bathroom stall in Swift Hall. This is still an unsolved murder, but it's believed that intelligence agencies were responsible. And this is how Graeber got into Agamben. He mentions that Agamben is cited in Couliano, but he doesn't mention what Couliano says about Agamben is that Agamben and others, many others, are wrong, that courtly love started in France. And he speculates that actually courtly love, the ideas, the main techniques or mechanisms of courtly love actually date to Sufism. It's kind of a tangent, but Graeber did write, this interesting article, There Has Never Been a West. I also put out something like, I didn't realize he had already written something with that same title, but this is a theme like, there is no clash of civilizations. There's the West realizing that everything came from somewhere else. And even though, Graeber was not into Nietzsche. And that's kind of Agamben too. Like, Agamben is like, I'm going to keep doing the theory, but I'm going to leave out Nietzsche and it's going to be theological, political. Maybe replace Nietzsche with Schmidt somehow. And Graeber too was like, we're going to leave Nietzsche out. I don't know, did he get that from Sahlins? I haven't found anywhere where Sahlins is actually writing about Nietzsche. He does have an interesting book on practical reason, but seems like Sahlins read Kant, but had kind of like an antagonistic relationship. And I don't really see much Kant in Graeber. This activist intellectualism was kind of a search. It had to have been a search for a ritual that could, based in history, scholarship, erudition, lift up some kind of new belief, like Deleuze and Guattari, called a belief in this world. Which, would that be a foundation for a real sovereignty? It couldn't be a popular sovereignty. It would have to be an intellectual sovereignty. And this was making me think of Bataille, because for Bataille, sovereignty was not this kind of like the one who decides on the exception, like in Schmidt, but in Bataille's posthumous work on sovereignty, it's instead enjoyment of the choice that really gives sovereignty its distinction. Joy, the party of joy. Right? I don't know. But when Foucault's looking for authentic selfhood, because it's all about austerity, sobriety, people usually distinguish that from the earlier transgression, Bataille, Foucault. Yet, in searching for that authentic self, this was kind of like the authentic sovereign. Oh, the philosopher as true king. The cynic philosopher as true king. Diogenes the protester. During the whole Occupy thing, people often associated with that, but associated, the occupiers with Diogenes. I read a few little blog pieces about that. Adbusters actually went to Davos, Well, Occupy, no matter how much it was configured as a response to the failure to prosecute bankers after the financial crisis, it was obviously like an echo of the image of the Arab Spring, and yet the origins of the Arab Spring are kind of obscure or suspect. Was it actually The Innocence of Muslims, the film that blasphemed Muhammad, that led to it, or was it the NED? In any case, you see, I think, the old Western order, the fake neoliberalism, which was itself just an attempt to recuperate what fell apart from the colonial empires after World War II. When you look at like the French Revolution, how long that took from, say, the first disruptions in 89 until you could really go all the way to the end of Napoleon I. That's quite a long time it takes for a nation to actually collapse, for a system to actually collapse. And this whole intervening revolutionary stage, some of those innovations were preserved. I mean, they were kind of nominally preserved and then redone in the post-Napoleonic era. Well, I mean, you could even say it took 60 years for the true modern French nation-state to emerge from the collapse of the Ancien regime. This is interesting for the scale and the differences in the structure. So when you're looking at what's gone on now and how long it's taken, whether you start at 2001 or you go back to even, what if you count Vietnam as the collapse of the United States? That would still fit, depending on how you really conceive of it, the complete collapse of the previous order and the installation of a new order. Clearly, on the one hand, you have something that was long-standing and stable, hitting up against a seemingly sudden disruption, socio-cultural disruption, followed by a long period of a struggle to obtain and reinstate some kind of new stability, which was achieved. On the other hand, with the current collapse and transformation, it's been kind of a slow grind, maybe even invisible, because of the way that France was France. The U.S. was never just the U.S. It was always a product of the interrelationships in this highly developed world system. Nonetheless, you can see here this scale in the transformation of the intrinsic quality of the American regime as it's crumbling on the inside. And I think that this is maybe the question, like, was the Great Depression just the end of the earlier period of America? And then you have the beginning of the military-industrial complex with the Korean War. That's actually, I think, what I would go for. So I think that there actually is, like, if we were to imagine that the scale matches with French Revolution scale and this 99-year schema, if we imagine that, then there's like a lot more time of struggle to come, perhaps the worst. These are the death throes of quite a long period of globalist expansion, really dating back to the Renaissance. Not that the Renaissance was to blame for that, but it came along with it. The end of magic Oh yeah, like I said, I think I'm going to have that upcoming video on the academic comedian, Slavoje. And then I need to stick with Hudson for part 3. Hudson versus, for me actually, going back to the Occupy times, he spoke at Berkeley right at that time, at the beginning of the Baxter Liberty Initiative lectures in the political science department, shared with Wendy Brown. Yeah, Hudson versus Epstein, the fate of economics. Classical liberalism, is it real? And I'm not sure what Professor Graeber would say, but money and magic clearly have a connection, and it's not necessarily an insult to either to say that. And now, maybe we have a new world of multipolar magic to look forward to.